Most water subsidies do not go to the poor. This may sound like a depressing message, but I hope that through the presentation you will also see how, by learning about why subsidies don't go to the poor, we can also think about how to better design subsidies so that they do reach the poor. The presentation has 4 parts. First, we're going to look very briefly at the types of residential water subsidies that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. Then we'll talk about whether or not subsidies reach the poor, who receives the largest subsidies, and in the end bring it all together by talking about benefit incidence, where the bulk of water subsidies go. So first, types of subsidies. I'm going to talk here about 2 basic types of subsidies. All are subsidies that are delivered through utilities to households. The first is consumption subsidy, which reduces the recurrent cost of water service to households. So in other words, it gives you a discount on what you have to pay every month for your water service. Connection subsidies are different. They're a one-time benefit that you get when you connect to the distribution network. Either of these 2 types of subsidies can be either targeted or untargeted. An untargeted subsidy would go to everyone who receives a subsidy. A targeted subsidy would only go to certain households, right? So untargeted subsidies would go to anyone who's eligible, and a targeted subsidy would go to only certain households. The most common type of subsidy amongst all water subsidies is clearly a combination of a generalized underpricing, which would be a general subsidy going to all households, with an increasing block tariff. Increasing block tariff, there's a picture here on the screen that shows that the price that you pay per cubic meter of water increases as you use more water. That's a basic increasing block tariff. It doesn't have to be combined with the general price subsidy, but in practice, in most utilities and in many developing countries, it is. So that most or all of these blocks are provided at a price that's below average cost. Do subsidies reach the poor? So to understand this, we're going to look at 3 things. We're going to look at whether or not poor households are eligible for subsidies, whether or not eligible households actually receive the subsidies, and then in particular we'll look at the case of increasing block tariffs. Who is eligible for water subsidies? Consumption subsidies can only go to households who have a connection to the water network. So one first question we want to ask if we want to find out whether subsidies make it to the poor is, are poor households actually connected to the network? For connection subsidies, these only go to unconnected households, and only to unconnected households who actually have the possibility of connecting. So for connection subsidies, we would rather want to ask, are poor households able to connect if they were offered a subsidy? Here in graphical form, if we look at all these smiley faces as our population, some of whom are poor and some of whom are non-poor, we can first say that those that I've X'd out here would be those who are not eligible for either type of subsidy because they don't even live in a neighborhood that has access to the water network. If you don't have access to the water network, you also can't connect. If you can't connect, you don't have a connection. So these households are not eligible for either a connection or a consumption subsidy. Then the next question is, who has a connection? The blue X's here, the second group that's crossed out, are those who don't have a connection. If you don't have a connection, that makes you eligible for a connection subsidy, provided that you have access to the network. So all of those blue X's represent households that could get a connection if they were offered a subsidy, say a connection subsidy. Everyone else who doesn't have an X does have a connection. That means they are eligible for a consumption subsidy. So if we look at this in a concrete example, here's an example from Cape Verde where I compare for poor households and then all households. We look at a number of statistics. The 2 white columns first The percentage of households that have access, meaning access to the network. So we see here 52% of poor households, 65% of all households have access to the network. That means that in this case, more than, well, almost half of poor households and a little bit less than half of all households do not even have access to the network. That makes them ineligible for connection or consumption subsidy. Among those who have access, what percentage of them already have connections? Amongst the poor, it's 20%, and among all households, it's 41%. We put these two together then, and in the columns on the far right, you see the percentage of total households, total poor households and total households, who are eligible for the consumption subsidy, and the percentage of all households who are eligible for the connection subsidy. In this case, because of 1, low coverage of the network, and 2, low coverage of connections amongst those who have access to the network, there are very few households in this case who are eligible for the consumption subsidy. Only 10% of households, of poor households, are connected, and about 27% of all households have connections. Those are the households who are eligible for the consumption subsidy, so very few. The connection subsidy is a little bit better. We have 42% of poor households and 38% of all households who would potentially be eligible for the connection subsidy. So this is a typical example of a low coverage situation. And you begin to see the problems that we're going to have delivering these subsidies to the poor. The next question is, do eligible households actually receive the subsidies? So assuming that we've determined who could receive a connection subsidy and who could receive a consumption subsidy, do they actually get it? Now here is where targeting becomes important. When you talk about general subsidies or untargeted subsidies, everyone is eligible. Everyone who's eligible will get the subsidy. So the targeting does not eliminate anyone. However, we do have to remember in the case of connection subsidies that even if there is a general connection subsidy, let's say that there's no connection fee for any new connection, everyone is eligible, but only those who actually decide themselves to connect will get the subsidy. So we saw in the case of Cape Verde, for example, that only 20% of households that had access to the network had actually connected. Now, perhaps if we offered them a connection subsidy, that percentage would be higher. But still, we might expect that for various reasons, some households might not actually connect. And that means that not everyone who's eligible for a connection subsidy would actually receive it, even if it were a general subsidy. When we use targeting, though, what we're trying to do is saying, of the universe of eligible households, let's try to target the subsidies to a smaller group. Now, of course, when you have a targeted subsidy combined with a general subsidy, what this means is not that we actually eliminate anyone, but that we use targeting to try to offer a larger discount or a larger subsidy to some households and a smaller subsidy to others, which is what happens in practice with the increasing block tariff combined with the general residential subsidy. There are various types of targeting. The most common is this use of quantity targeting, which is what we see in the increasing block tariff. We're trying to target subsidies or larger subsidies to the lowest volume consumers. But there are other options. There is administrative targeting with things like means testing or geographic targeting, where we say, for example, we could give a subsidy to everyone who lives in a slum area. There's also categorical targeting. Say you pick everyone with one characteristic. Every pensioner, for example, could receive a subsidy. Another type of subsidy, which is less common but also possible, is I'm calling here service level subsidies. So that would be where you only provide the subsidy to those who use a particular type of service. A common example, or the most common perhaps that exists in water, is stand posts. So everyone who uses a public stand post may get a subsidy, but people who don't would not.